as soon as I quite shut this down. Good?
Did you say you put share screen?
Share,
And share it because there's no way to see it.
because we would see it on them too, right?
Yes.
And I need actually,
You need to get off here
actually, I need to,
and then record.
I already hit record,
Okay, so you share.
but I need to share sound as well.
In the Zoom box, yes.
So they say share screen.
If I get the mouse to come back to me. We're having mouse difficulties with this computer, guys. Do you see the mouse?
Yep.
There it is.
No, like click on the green arrow. Yeah, share screen. So here.
That shares the whole computer. That way if you switch back and forth,
Yeah.
it switches back.
And then move that little box that says talking to the side.
You don't want it there?
It's distracting.
Okay, now I gotta get back down to display mode. So where's my display mode, Connor? Way too hard. Okay, now it would be nice to be on the first line. Okay. Here we go. Welcome, audience. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about expanding your chemical safety horizons. That is, what is chemical safety going to look like in the next 50 years? And so we're going to move it from the 20th century to the 21st century, hopefully. So if you talk about 20th century chemical safety, and I guess I'll just look at the screen here.
You have that pencil there. You can use a pencil as a cursor too.
But you can't see that this mouse really needs to be replaced. Is this going to be the whole story the whole time? I'll leave it right there. So our rules dictated what we did in the 20th century. Use common sense, wear some PPE, don't be a wimp, be careful, don't get hurt, follow the rules, and you'll be fine. So that's basically 20th century safety. And pretty much 20th century safety, this is where it got us in research labs. And if you look at the top left, that's the University of Hawaii, where they had a severe explosion of an air tank, and it severed the researcher's arm. And then the bottom left is Texas Tech incident that happened in 2010, where a graduate researcher was working with a shock-sensitive material and it detonated. This one here on the bottom right, that's where Sherry Sanjay burned on the floor in her research lab using TBO lithium. And then the top right one is an incident that was never reported. This is from Georgia, University of Georgia, I believe. And it never got reported in the news. It was in the paper for like overnight, and somehow the University of Georgia got it removed. And so my theory, and it's just anecdotal, is that if you look at accidents and incidents in research laboratories, maybe a quarter of them don't get reported, and it's probably higher. This one was pretty severe. It looked to be a waste jug explosion, but it was never investigated since, or publicly investigated, since it was never reported. So after the death of Sherry Sanjay and the Texas Tech incident, many in the ACS began advocating for a shift in our approach to chemical safety education. And in, I can't remember the exact year, but I was asked to be on the task force to write the guidance for the ACS. So what happened was the Texas Tech incident was investigated by the Chemical Safety Board. It's the first academic incident ever to be investigated by the U.S. Chemical Safety Board. And they put out recommendations to OSHA, recommendations to Texas Tech, recommendations to the ACS, several recommendations. And so the recommendation to ACS was to write guidance, it's there in dark quote, develop good practice guidance that identifies and describes methodologies to assess and control hazards that can be used successfully in a research laboratory. And so the book that was written had 5 tools in it for evaluating risk. And I worked on the chapter for job hazard analysis. And you might notice the cover, this book was never put in print, but you might notice this is one of our researchers. And because they asked for cover pictures, and I was the only one that, somebody over at Oak Ridge took some pictures over there. But this is me with Alex. I can't remember Alex's last name. He's Carol's student. But we're looking at a risk assessment. So we got our covers on the book, and we got our pictures on the book. And then in 2016, to further address changing the paradigm into the 21st century, somebody's in the chat. Do you have a computer, Connor?
I do.
Can you monitor the chat and see if there's a problem? Yeah, I don't know if there's a problem. Alan Day, thanks, Carol. Okay. Yeah, Catarino is the student in Mike's lab. All right, so then in 2016, just wanted to see if you guys were paying attention. ACS added safety to their core value. And so that got a lot more momentum into, ACS is still the biggest scientific organization in the world. It's about 150,000 members. And so that got a lot of momentum into the picture for changing the way we educate students in chemical safety. Okay, so how do we move safety into the 21st century? We develop a new mindset, which in turn gives us some new results. Would this be better down here for you guys in person, or does it matter where you put that? Better up top. Okay. All right. So, as written on the Committee for Chemical Safety, which is the ACS is organized into divisions and into committees. Committees are part of the ACS governance. They actually have governance. They're the ones that have counselors that vote on changes to bylaws and that kind of stuff. So the Committee on Chemical Safety put out this statement that chemistry professionals have an ethical and legal responsibility to work safely. They protect themselves and their communities. They address safety and health issues when contributing to the scientific literature. And chemistry professionals need to develop a competency in evaluating hazards and conducting risk assessments. So this is the corporate social responsibility pyramid from Archie Carroll. And he says that, and not everybody agrees with this, that you have productivity responsibilities at your place of work. You have legal responsibilities at your place of work, ethical responsibilities, and social responsibilities. So if we make that analogous to, an academic department, you add to scientific community, you create knowledge. That's your productivity. You obey the laws and regulations of your place of work. At least we hope you do. That's your community of work. Your community of practice, your like-minded people, do no harm, do what's just and fair. That's your ethical responsibility. Your responsibility socially in your community is to be a safe researcher. So if we talk about recognize that chemical safety is more than just a skill. In the 20th century, it was skill-based. You took enough lab courses, you did everything that you needed to do, you learned all the hazards, and you learned how to mitigate risk. Well, the thing is that you can't possibly encounter everything that can happen in that kind of construct. So what we need to do is take skills, knowledge, and attitude. They're called KSAs, and this is how we develop competencies in our brain. It's a group of skills, knowledge, and attitude for whatever subject we're talking about. And that's how we learn. And so what we want to do is we want to create more accommodation. So in accommodation and assimilation, in accommodation, you're making places in your brain. This is how young children learn. You're making places in your brain to put information. So you see a big animal and you say, somebody tells you it's a horse. And then you drive down the road and you see a cow and you say horse. And they have to tell you no, because your box only knows big animals as horses. So we're making more boxes and we're putting more stuff into our boxes. And so we never really, with rules, learn to make those boxes and to put new information into them. So we're going to go from rules to risk assessment, from memorization to critical thinking. How do we get there? Well, how do we look at moving this paradigm forward? Because we're so accustomed to making a rule for everything. So we need today, information data is overwhelming. And so we have to have a way to structure what we take in, our data, our information. We have to include best practices and regulatory. I mean, you can't get away from regulatory, but you don't want it to be your overarching guide on why you're behaving safely. And the other thing that's hard in safety is that there's rarely a right answer. Somebody will ask me a question, what should I do here? And I say, well, you can do this or you can do this. This has this drawback, this has this drawback. Rarely a correct answer. And students like correct answers. Faculty like correct answers. But I can just give you a best opinion. That's why it's so hard in the court cases on safety, because they want black and white. They want rules. But in safety, we have best practices. So it's very difficult to advocate for, well, they shouldn't have done it, but I can't give you an exact rule why they shouldn't have done it. So there's constant change based on the current situation. In discovery research labs, rules may not apply. You're going to come upon a new substance. You're going to come upon a new reaction, and you have to be able to take that assimilation and accommodation critical thinking skill and develop your own solution for the problem. And that's what we need to start getting students to be better at. So how do we do that? How do we build student safety competencies and develop a safety management system? We're going to take data and information, we're going to assimilate and accommodate, and we're going to assess risks, minimize risk, prepare for emergencies, and recognize hazards. And we're going to base it on lessons learned, because lessons learned are very valuable. One of the downsides that we've had in the American Chemical Society is getting a national database of incidents, because nobody wants to report. There is still this punitive type attitude that they're afraid something will happen or they'll be fired or something. Although I'm not sure you can fire anybody in academia, but it's hard to get lessons learned recorded. So let's think of a way that we can utilize this system. So in that wheel, I didn't read them in this order, but if we talk about RAMP, we can come up with an easy acronym to remember the steps. We're going to recognize hazards. You can't fix anything you don't recognize. We're going to assess what risk there is from that hazard, minimize the risk, and prepare for emergencies. So this is the risk management system built on RAMP. You can apply it to your lab, to an experiment, to crossing the street. It's really a mindset. So here's one of my favorite little graphics that I stole off the internet. Obviously, this little guy has done some sort of risk assessment, and he's decided that he can safely attempt to cheese by putting a helmet on without getting his neck broken. I don't know if it's a valid risk assessment, but he's done one. All right, so let's look at the R, the recognized hazards. What are hazards? What kind of hazards are there? And this is the step where we're going to generate knowledge. So we're going to build boxes. Okay? So let's define hazards. Hazards are a potential for harm, simply stated. And it's an intrinsic property for agents, equipment, and conditions And you have to recognize them, as I previously said. This is the R step of ramp. It's intrinsic, meaning that if I'm going to use a particular solvent, it has intrinsic hazard. I can't change that. And so I developed a mind map. How do I recognize chemical hazard? Well, in the best thing we've had really in either century is called globally harmonized system of classification and labeling. And so I developed this mind map to kind of lay out what GHS is about. GHS has three broad groups: physical hazards, environmental hazards, and health hazards. And within the groups, it has classes. So there's 17 physical hazard classes, like explosives, organic peroxides, these all make sense. And then there's health hazards. There's 10 classes of health hazard. There's 2 environmental classes. And then you got the little chicken feet coming off of each class. Those are categories. So just briefly, I'll explain. Organic peroxides have 5 levels of category classification. So from 1 to 5, or if I counted right, I'm not sure I counted right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 is the least hazardous, and 1 is the most hazardous. The lower your number, the more hazardous in GHS. That's enough of that. So other hazards, we can't forget about non-chemical hazards. So remember, chemicals have physical hazards and health hazards and environmental hazards. But we also have physical hazards from stuff like radiation, experimental process, high temperature, low temperature, extreme cold, mechanical hazards, pinched-in hazards, biological hazards. We have so much cross-disciplinary work going on now that you have biologists, physicists, and chemists all working in the same lab, not really fully understanding maybe each other's hazards. So it adds complexity to the system. So here, once we've recognized our hazards, either physical or chemical, we're going to apply that knowledge and assess risk. And we have to know, how risky is it? So risk is a probability that the hazard, if I don't do anything, will result in harm or damage. So it's evaluated. Usually people look at major C's doing this, some kind of likelihood and consequence. It's really likely that this is going to happen, but the consequence is nothing. So I'm not going to worry about that hazard. Okay, it's highly unlikely that this will happen, but I'm going to blow the building up if it does. So I really need to focus on this hazard. So you look at the risk and evaluate it. This is the hardest part of RAMP because it's got subjective and objective components. And people take subjective risk very differently. So, objective risk, if I break glass and I clean it up with my hand, there's a pretty good chance I might cut myself. If I put on a glove, I can reduce that risk. If I use a broom and dustpan, I can virtually eliminate that risk. So you can reduce risk. Practical example, if I need to use benzene as a solvent, it's a known UV carcinogen, and it's flammable, it's highly flammable. But if I work in a fume hood, I'm going to reduce my exposure, and I'm using a small amount, probably a laboratory scale amount, and I'm taking the vapors away, so I'm not being exposed, it's not as flammable with the reduction of vapors, so I've reduced risk to an acceptable level. So none of this says we can't use the chemicals we need to use. It just says we need to learn to use them safely. Subjective risk, we all come to the table with our own preconceived ideas. Our perception of risk limits our decision-making capabilities. I'm the Wild West person. I like taking risks. I'm going to do what I want to do. You're not going to tell me I can't do it. And so, you know, you've got that attitude. You've got the attitude, I'm too scared to do anything. So you've got all kinds of level of risk acceptance. We have to make decisions. And we use heuristics or heuristics to make decisions every day, all day long. If you had to do a risk assessment when you got up in the morning to, like, what am I going to eat? What am I going to wear? Those kind of decisions just are made automatically. That's heuristics. So we're making those constant decisions based on what we know, but we may not always in safety have the information we need to make the right decision. That's where building that competency on knowledge helps. Change drivers. These are very important in research because if you change things without considering how it affects other things, you may result in bad effects. So just some rough examples. These are subjective and objective, but let's look at a few. Scale up. Scale up is what caused the Texas Tech incident. A new person or team or in the lab, that's Sherry Sanjay. She was relatively new, and that's what caused, it was not the root cause, but it was one of the contributing factors to her incident. And then the modification of equipment in the University of Hawaii, they had taken that air tank, they were adding hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide to make a culture medium for cells. They've been doing it for 8 years. And they had a gauge on it that they modified that tank and it sparked. And it ignited those gases. And they actually had a minor incident, but nobody had reported it or nobody had done anything about it before that severe incident. So that was the University of Hawaii's incident. Okay, we've generated knowledge, we've applied knowledge, now let's implement some ideas. We're going to minimize risk that we know we have hazard, we know we have risk, we're going to implement some things, controls to reduce the risk. To reduce risk, you can use this little graphic it's actually from NIOSH, and it's an inverted pyramid because the controls at the top are the most effective. If I eliminate something, if I say, okay, I don't really need benzene, I can do this with water. That's substitution, but you've eliminated the benzene. So, and that would never be practical, I'm sure, but you physically remove the hazard. So some elimination, substitute something less hazardous, engineer it out, use a fume hood, administrate it out, put up signs, do risk assessments, write SOPs, and PPE notice is the least effective because if PPE fails, you've got exposure. If that's your only plan, I'm going to put on those gloves and I'm invincible. Well, you don't even probably know if they're the right gloves if you haven't done a risk assessment. So how do you account for subjective risk in the labs? Be vigilant about recognizing hazards and change. Ask questions, establish boundaries. I'm not going to go past this temperature without reevaluating. Communicate incidents and anything going on in the lab to everybody. Report near misses. Include hazard information in your weekly meetings and perform a hazard analysis and risk assessment. Finally, we get to the last part of RAMP where we get to practice some skills, and this we don't do a great job of either. Yeah, I got an eye wash over here, but have I ever used it? Do I know how to use it? So with the preparing for emergencies, it's not just enough to say, I know I have that equipment. I don't even know if it works. I've never tested it. Never mind used it. So you need to test, you need to use, you need to drill. This is why police and fire and EMTs drill and practice, because those responses need to become robot. You can't be thinking if you're in the middle of an emergency. You've got to be able to act. And so I think we really do a poor job in this area. This is an interesting thing I found. It was preparing for a disaster. Over half of Americans think that they'll experience some natural or man-made disaster. 86% of them know that FEMA recommends that a 72-hour kit would help, but 72% have made no effort to put the kit together. So we recognize it, but we don't think it's going to happen to us. And why don't we think it's going to happen to us? Emergency services will help me. Does anybody even know how long it would take for an ambulance or fire truck to get here? How long do you need to react before you get help? I don't have the time. This is a great one in academia. I don't want to think about it. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm just scared. So, risk assessment helps to zero in places in a procedure where loss of control could be minimized. So what's a risk assessment? It's a systematic approach one uses to evaluate an experiment in order to document obvious hazards and uncover latent ones. So this is a little, like a 2-minute video.
Remember when you first started doing research in the lab?
Well,
Everything was so daunting. You had to think about
where's my sound? This is on. Well, I can't see. Is there any other sound that could be turned off?
I don't know. I think Zoom has something with sound.
Dr.
Oh, there
Bates,
is something in the chat.
Dr. Bates put in the chat, if you're sharing sound through Zoom, it might not work on the computer.
Yeah, there is a sound to Zoom.
Share sound. I do have it checked.
What does the chat say?
Wow, it's a house.
Yeah, I think Jeb was saying, oh, smokes, sound like I'm really loud.
Well, so we know the sound's working.
I think he was saying you could do one or the other.
I can hear it.
Oh, so you can hear it? I got you. So if you guys can hear it, I'm good, although we won't hear it in here. I'm gonna do it from my office next time.
Remember when you first started doing research in the
You
lab?
guys hear it?
Everything was so daunting. You had to think about every step and make sure you'd really thought it through. But now that you've done it 100 times, it's easy, right?
Or at least I could hear
It's
it
like
fine.
crossing the street.
Can you
No
turn your sound
problem.
off?
You could do it blindfolded. No.
You got your
There's
feedback.
feedback.
Never mind. Just-
Even though it's the same
I can hear it.
Oh, now you've paused it.
I should have unpaused it just now.
street that's part of your daily routine, you always look both ways. Always. Your experiment, like the street, is in flux. Science that seems straightforward turns out to be fairly complex. Conditions change, and even routine experiments carry risks. By assessing these risks and preparing for foreseeable emergencies, you can make the lab safer. And doing a risk assessment makes you a better scientist. A hazard assessment will identify all the possible things that could go wrong. And a risk assessment is a priority list of these. Which are the most likely to present a risk? You've made a habit of looking both ways each time you cross the street. Make a habit of recognizing, assessing, and managing hazards, and preparing for emergencies. These steps are the foundations of a good risk assessment and the foundations of good science. I know what you're thinking. A risk assessment? There are always reasons why we become complacent. But I've only changed one thing. It's just another solvent, right? But I was only using a few drops of bromine. I've done this loads of times. I'm just scaling it up.
Weird watching it without.
I couldn't use the blast shield. Someone else was using it. But nothing has changed. But if I had done a risk assessment, I wouldn't have had time to set up the experiment. Don't worry, my colleague did a risk assessment, and I'm sure it was very thorough. Because both good science and lab safety require planning, preparation, and constant attention to changing conditions. Because you'd never say, I don't need to look both ways today. I did that yesterday.
Okay, so I hope you guys were able to What is risk assessment? Continued here. The tool is a communication tool. So it communicates, once you've got it in writing, it communicates to all people, stakeholders, what's going on in that room. And I'm telling you that there have been used now in court cases. Risk assessments are being asked for because it's required by NFPA 45. But it's also a strong educational tool. It can teach people how to think critically. And you can design it at all kinds of levels. You can design it from this won't take that long to this, depending on the risk involved in the operation, you might have to do a much more thorough assessment. So it doesn't have to take a lot of time. Here's the NFPA 45, which is fire protection in laboratories using chemicals. I don't know if we are bound legally by NFPA 45, but it's now considered best practices. And we are instructional laboratories at the university level. They talk about educational laboratories and instructional laboratories. Education is K-12, instruction is higher learning. And so where instructors are performing demonstration and students are conducting experiments, you shall have a risk assessment, provide a safety briefing, use PPE, and they're talking about even having it documented and peer reviewed. So just thought I'd throw that in there. So the purpose of a risk assessment is not simply to restate how to do the experiment. Your experimental procedure does that. You want to ask what can go wrong and how can I prevent it? Redundancy, which is having multiple components in a system that do the same thing, that can take over if one fails. And layering, I'm going to work in the hood, I'm going to wear goggles, and I'm going to wear a face shield too. So I'm going to layer my controls. It's going away. This mouse is enough to make somebody crazy.
The space bar will advance.
Let's see. Thank you, Connor. There are many forms. The document, who should have told me? Documentation can take, and a good tool will ramp. It'll recognize, assess, minimize, and prepare for emergencies. It's iterative. It's not a one and done. You change something, you might need to look at it again. So let's talk just a minute of how it helps students as well. When we think about thinking, how we think divergently and convergently. That is, divergent thinking takes an idea and comes up with many solutions. Convergent thinking takes a lot of information in and comes to one solution. So if you think about ramping, here you recognize you're using convergent thinking to get to your risk assessment. Once you get to your risk assessment, where you've assessed what kind of risk you have from your hazards, then you have to diverge and come up and implement plans where you train, control, and come up with ways to reduce that risk. So what does a tool look like? A tool can be as simple as asking 5 questions. What are the hazards? What type of ventilation do I need? What personal protection do I need? What emergency response protocols do I need? And what do I do with the waste? If you can ask and answer those 5 questions in a written form, you've done a risk assessment, if you've done a good job. And you can tie those into the ramp process. That's what's done in this little graphic. You could do a bow tie. Bow tie analysis is a visual way to look at hazard analysis or risk analysis, where you take a threat over here on the left side. Let's ramp it. So we've got a flammable solvent. We've recognized we have a hazard. There's what's called the top event in a bow tie, where control is lost, and that's where you've assessed your risk. Your threats are over here on the left. You're going to put things in place between the threat and the top event to minimize. And if all goes to hell, you're going to put things in between the top event and the consequence over here to prepare for emergencies. So bow tie is just another tool you can use. Storyboarding. Nick and I came up with this idea of storyboarding. Dr. Shaw and I worked on it. It was his idea, and we just put it into a research setting where you integrate into all the steps of a normal procedure that you might do. And he uses sticky notes to bring in the experimental planning, the experimental setup, the procedure, the reaction, how, and preparing for emergencies. So he does his reaction stepwise, so he can look at each component on every step. You can do a job hazard analysis. Anybody in 3000 has done a job hazard analysis. This is where you take a task and you break it into steps. And basically when you're done, you've written your experimental procedure. And you look at the hazards, the risk, and the minimization on each step. So the RAMP system can be a risk management system that pulls everything together, where you've recognized, assessed, minimized, and prepared using convergent and divergent thinking. You've assimilated and accommodated. You've learned something. And so now is the point where you say, nah, why would I do this? Okay, your ethical responsibility, we started out with that. Performing risk assessment develops skills in students and teaches them knowledge by making them find information. Safe science is good science. NFPA has been tested in the courts. So if all that's not anything that might convince you, and I'm sure there's still doubters, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that nothing could go wrong. You've done this many times before. To tell you the truth, most likely the heat generated will dissipate without incident. But being that the result of an uncontrolled energetic reaction can put an end to your career or life, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do you feel lucky? Well, do you? So, we're shifting the old paradigm to the new paradigm. Technical aspects were transferred as skills. Well, we want to learn to apply hazard identification and risk assessment to transfer these technical skills. We want to get away from enforcement and compliance and use leadership and empowerment. We want to make leaders that feel empowered to be accountable for their own safety and the safety of their community. Safety knowledge is transferred in the old system by training. You train on one subject, bloodborne pathogens, radiation, whatever it is. We want to teach people how to address novel situations in discovery research, how to build their own toolbox. And we're going to integrate those subjects into the curriculum. Safety management is based on training and rules. We want to build a social construct where everybody values chemical safety as a transferable, sustainable, and something that's compatible with discovery research. Can be integrated into research. And if you want to, I've already mentioned this, I don't know if the students know this, there's a free course at the ACS now called Foundations of Chemical Safety and Risk Management. You don't have to be a member of the American Chemical Society. You can just go type in ACS safety course. Hopefully it'll pull it up. And if not, email me, but you can, it's self-paced, online, and free. And you can learn more about RAMP and chemical safety. And that's that. Thank you for listening. Yay. So I'm going to stop recording. Anybody have any questions?
I actually have a question.
Should I leave the recording on? Oh, Caroline. Hey, Caroline, what's it?
So do you have any suggestions on how to improve the reporting rate of incidents? Like, even if it's a near miss incident, we have graduate students, like the organization that I'm a part of, we're trying to have like an anonymous reporting for near miss incidents. That way we can collect the data on accidents that occur, and as well as to give them feedback on ways to not let that happen again. But they have such fear of retaliation that they're not even willing to do it anonymous, just because with information they are worried that they can still be figured out. So do you just have any suggestions on how we can improve that?
Money? I really don't. You know, if you saying that your form is anonymous, it doesn't track emails.
Yes, yeah. So previously it was just within JST, but the faculty advisor had spoken to other faculty members. So now I'm trying to restart this program where even the faculty advisor is not going to see it, like no one but above graduate students will see it. But even with that said and pitched to graduate students, they still are unwilling. So
Yeah, this is, I mean, this is the national dilemma, right? This is why we've never been able to get a lessons learned database going. There is, and I'll have to get it for you. I don't even know the name of it off the top of my head. They have actually started CAS registry, I think, is taking care of it. They've actually started a database in conjunction with industry and CAS database. ACS took it over. And so theirs is truly anonymous. And so maybe you could get them to report there.
I'm sorry, I missed the organization or university that you said.
So I think it's the CAS, the Chemical Abstract Service, has set this up. I'll find the information and email it to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, but yeah, that is one of the, you know, it doesn't matter how often you say, well, there's not going to be punitive result, that people are just leery about reporting.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how to learn if you don't report it. And they get really bad if the graduate students don't put it in their lab notebooks. But they, you know, they really should be publishing those near misses in their publications with the safety statements, with the requirement now that's in ACS journals with the safety statement. So, you know, if you publish something and you know that you had a place where there was a near miss and you don't disseminate that information, you have not done your due diligence to the society, to the greater knowledge base. And somebody got hurt because they tried to reproduce the work and ended up with an incident. I mean, just think how you might feel if that happened. So that should be in your safety statement.
Yeah, I like that idea. That's awesome. And
yeah, try to pull it in and relate it to that it, you know, it should be in their safety statement.
Hey, Sammy.
Hey, Bob.
So I know you're still, we're in the implementation phase of this and probably don't have a great deal of data on how efficacious it is transitioning to this new paradigm. But it seems to me like there's been attempts to do this in other industries. And is there any, like, I'm thinking about like construction industry, where they're trying to promote a culture of safety. And I don't know how effective it's been, but are there any data from other industries that support making this switch or have generated best practices or anything like that?
Yeah, there's two industries that do it really well, the aviation industry and the medical industry. So, and so they thought about it long and hard. Right now, I'm in the process of, I just learned about this new concept, well, it's not new, it's been around for a long time, between, and maybe you've heard about it, between tight and loose cultures. That, and this came up with in regard to COVID, that they had better success managing COVID in societies that are tight, meaning they have a higher rule of quality, whereas the U.S. is more loose culture-wise, and so that translates at every level, right? In the lab, in the whole society, and so say someplace like South Korea or North Korea, well, we really don't know, right? We could only get it. We don't get any news. But there's places that the society will obey things better. And so in industry, you have threat, right? You're gonna lose your job if you don't follow the rules. So I don't think that'll ever work in academia because you don't have those threats, right? So I've been thinking about this a lot. How do you get people to do the right thing when the only reason for them to do the right thing is to protect the community and themselves? And so anecdotally, I don't have anything, but I do know that the medical industry has given, like, nurses and co-pilots in the aviation, they can actually say something to their higher ups. Like a nurse can stop a procedure, a co-pilot can stop a pilot. So they've given them that permission to speak up. So if we could get that kind of motivation to graduate students being able to speak up and say, this is not right, we shouldn't be doing it this way. If we could come to that kind of place, that would be helpful. But yeah, I don't know how to do that. That was a lot of answer for a short question.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a little bit of a different power dynamic between a grad student and a PhD advisor versus like a co-pilot and a pilot where they're both employed by somebody higher up. So yeah, I could see how that would be a little more difficult, but thanks.
Like my son, he's a staff sergeant, and he can ground a plane, and a colonel that flies the plane cannot override him. He said it's not safe to fly. Even though he's had situations where a colonel gets in space, wants to fly the plane, and that's right, I sign off on it.
Yeah, so it's really gonna be a serious culture change. And more academic institutions are going to have to put things in place that affect tenure and promotion. You know, so you're going to have some level of threat at some place to get a big change. And I don't mean beat people up. I just mean that as long as humans know that they can get away with something, they'll get away with it. So there's people like me that will do the right thing when nobody's looking, and there's people that won't do the right thing even when everybody's looking. So you just can't, human nature, and I think that's something that in academia, something I've been thinking about a lot. I think that in safety, we've never considered the psychology and sociology part of it enough, because it's really steep in those two things, in the social sciences. Anyways, thanks for asking. Anybody else? Well, I'll go home and muddle some more.
One thing, I'll just bring up one thing. Caroline might want to investigate if there's still anything on the internet about it. But DuPont was probably the first company I ever saw that started trying to move towards the 21st century, but that was back in the 1980s when they had a program called the STOP program. If that's still out there, Caroline might want to look at that.
And now the joint safety teams that she's talking about, the JSP that she's on, Caroline Kim said that to check it, see if DuPont's got anything. But Dow is another company. You can see what they're doing, and they work with academia very heavily. In fact, they may be the ones that started the joint safety team program.
I didn't know that. I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for coming, Caroline.
Yep, thanks for having me. Good seeing all familiar names and faces.
For those of you that don't know, Caroline's just been awarded the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship at UConn. So everybody should congratulate her. Very prestigious.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me stop recording. I don't think we need to record video of that. Thank you, Connor. I was here when they gave the first shirt out, hydrogen. How many years ago was that? What are we on? What's the chemical? What are we on now?
Thank you, Charles.